So in case you're wondering, Dayenu means enough. So if God had led us out of Egypt, that would have been enough. If God had led us to safety, that would have been enough. If God had protected us from our enemies, that would have been enough. If God had led us across the waters, that would have been enough. And it goes on to entry into the promised land. And then it goes beyond that and goes into the gift of Jesus Christ and what that promise means to us. That is the message of that song. The passage is difficult actually in some ways, right? It's a celebration. It's a celebration of death. Reverend Cheryl and I went to a conference once, and I heard a preacher from the States. Her name is Teresa Fry Brown. And Teresa said that preachers should try and do things a little bit differently. And she said, imagine preaching a sermon from the perspective of the water. So what would that sermon sound like? A sermon from the perspective of the water. So there you are, you're the Red Sea. You're laying there pretty placidly. And all of a sudden, this power which we recognize, that we hear as the hand of God, reaches in and you part. And so you are now separated from yourself. And then the people you witness, the people walking through between your two walls of water, and that you see them walking up on the other side, and then all of a sudden you are brought back down so that you drown this whole collection of people. You're used, so if you're the water, you're used as a tool of violence. Now, I heard her say that, and I was like, oh my, like imagine preaching that sermon. I'm not preaching that sermon. Not today anyway. What I do want to preach, so here's where I want to start. I was born in 1962. Yes, that makes me old. Well, no, it does. That means that this year I turned 61. Yeah. Okay. They say the memory is the first thing that goes. But I grew up with the best music ever. I grew up with the Mamas and the Papas and the Byrds and Stevie Nicks, right? Stevie Nicks, who made a tambourine famous. I grew up with the music of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Some of it I can give away. I grew up with the music of Steve Miller. I grew up in the era when the cowbell moved from the field onto the rock and roll stage. And I fully ascribe to the title of today's sermon. You can never have too much cowbell. But these are simple instruments that we can use to elicit incredible joy. And that's where I want to sort of sit today. The song, like Miriam, Scripture tells us, and so when I was talking to the kids, that's what Scripture says, that as the people of Israel were preparing to leave Egypt, they gathered up all of the things that they treasured. So imagine you are going to start on a great trip, and you're not going to be returning to your home as you know it. We've actually had to think about that lately, right? With fires that are decimating communities. And I don't know about you, but in our house, we've had the conversation. if we were going to have to evacuate our home and didn't know that we would be coming back, what are the things that we would bring with us? Now, photographs. But if you're like our house, you couldn't take all of the photographs. So you'd have to decide which photographs were most important. What were those particular gifts that were given to you by a child, by a grandchild, by a spouse, by a parent, that you just could not imagine setting up a new house and not putting that on the mantle? What are those valued pieces of clothing? What food would you want to take out of your pantry to take with you in order to sustain you for the coming days, weeks, months, and in the case of the people of Israel, years? Fleeing from extreme oppression and violence, what would be the last thing you grabbed as you walked out the door? For Miriam, it was tambourines and drums. Miriam grabbed the tambourine and the drum, instruments that would create music. Instruments that, now, with the drum, it marks cadence for that walk through the desert, that walk through the sea, that walk through the days, through the months, through the years, reminding you in those most difficult days to continue putting one step in front of the other. When exhaustion overtakes you, you just keep on moving, because that's what you have to do. But the instruments were also there to mark those moments of accomplishment, when celebration could be had, when all you wanted to do was sing a song and maybe even dance a jig. Now, I'm not going to dance. But the story, so remember 2 weeks ago when I started this reflection on Exodus, I talked about the story of the transformation of a man. Moses was transformed by his encounter with God and through the experience in Egypt and into the Promised Land. But it is also the story of the transformation of a nation. It is a nation that was, we talk about now the diaspora, so it was spread out. But this significant core was in Egypt and was caught in slavery, was oppressed, was downtrodden. But from there, Moses, who was called by God, enters in. And after we know the story, are we going to talk about we don't talk about the experience in Egypt, do we? Like this year. But remember, all of those, the threats and the plagues and the turning the water red, and it's all of those, like the 10 things that all happened, and then the taking of the firstborn son, and again, that harkens forward to other stories, harkens back to earlier stories. But from there, the people of Israel, they move from this downtrodden to a people who are now a people of hope. But, and the story goes on, and it's a brutal story. It's a brutal story. It's a story that each of us can relate to as a community, but also as individuals, as people of faith. We find ourselves at those moments when we are just without hope. Without hope. We've then moved to moments when we have had those, and we talk about it in our faith, we talk about those epiphany moments when we are confronted by the full glory, the passion of God, the love of God just overflowing into our lives. And we would think that once we experience that all life would be bliss, but it's not, because we continue the journey. And we see God's presence in our life, but then we start to doubt it, and we question it, and we find ourselves in low places again, only to be once again lifted up. And the beauty of this story for me with Miriam is that Miriam brings the instruments so that they can be consoling in times of despair. They can be celebratory in times of joy. They are always present. Music is the thing that can carry us through any moment in our life. This week, well, actually the last couple of weeks, this congregation has suffered. The choir is smaller today than it was 6 months ago. There are significant voices missing from our choir today, and we know it. And each one of us felt it. When we walked into this sanctuary this morning, we felt it. What is worship going to be like without Billy and without Val? Now, 6 months ago, we sang as a choir with incredible joy, just loving each other's presence. Today, we sing together with a tinge of grief and sadness, but with joy overwhelming. Across the street on Friday, I talked about the fact that for decades in this congregation, that Val led us in music. She played for us the music of our faith. But today, Val is the music. Val has joined the choir of the cosmos. And we can sing, we can sing in the midst of our grief, in the midst of the struggle. We can sing. And at some point, we will sing joyfully, lustfully, and we might even want to dance in the aisle. And that's what Miriam knew on that day when they were walking out of that homeland that they knew. And it was filled with oppression, it was filled with violence, but it was what they knew. It was what was comfortable. The journey was not always going to be easy, and she knew that too. But she knew that the people would have to be reminded at times of the joy that was theirs, of the presence of God. Our First Nations brothers and sisters talk about the drum as offering to us the heartbeat of God. And as we walk through our lives, sometimes we don't need it to be reminded. But sometimes it is good to be reminded that we are not alone. That through every moment of every day, our God is with us. Thanks be to God.